My presentation is on orality in African philosophy. African societies, for the most part, were oral cultures with no writing tradition. Of course, there are numerous exceptions, such as ancient Egyptian philosophy and Ge'ez philosophy. However, overwhelmingly, Africa was illiterate, and so Africa's philosophical tradition was presumably spoken, which opens up a can of worms. This is for numerous reasons. Firstly, there is debate about whether philosophy proper requires writing. While Peter O. Bodonran states that surely writing is not prerequisite for philosophy, but I doubt whether philosophy can progress adequately without writing. Had others not written down the sayings of Socrates, the pre-Socratics, and Buddha, we today would not regard them as philosophers, for their thoughts would have been lost in the mythological world of proverbs and pithy sayings. While there are figures such as Socrates and Thales, who were known not to themselves transcribe their philosophic ideas, largely the Western philosophic tradition, upon which all others, for better or worse, are compared, is a written exercise, and as Bodonran explains here, had they not been, they would have likely been lost to time and not have gone on to influence future generations. Henry Oderuka takes an opposing view, stating, "We should not make a great deal about writing. Writing is a good way to store thought and so to store philosophy, but writing is not thinking, and philosophy is thinking. One can think even if one is incapable of or has no facilities for writing." Moreover, he identifies the potential advantage of an oral tradition. In a tradition without writing, people make full use of their memories. They even improve their memories by the use of symbols of various kinds. While Bodonran and Oderuka agree that philosophy can be spoken, but Bodonran clearly favors the Western philosophic convention for its supposed ability to reduce distortion and preserve the knowledge for posterity. Oderuka would go on to pursue a more inclusive approach to African philosophy that centered initially around illiterate philosophic sages. What complicates matters is exactly the issue Bodonran highlights of a relative transience of oral philosophy. For beyond a few generations, these philosophic sages Oderuka studied become forgotten, and so mapping a history of African oral philosophy is difficult. This circumstance has led African philosophers to expand definitions of philosophy beyond that of the individual scholar, arguing that they do not apply to African contexts. Kwame Gyekye, for example, argues that philosophical concepts, ideas, and propositions can be found embedded in African proverbs, linguistic expressions, myths, and folk tales, religious beliefs and rituals, customs and traditions of the people in their art symbols, and in their socio-political institutions. Examining these cultural practices would then allow Africans to reconstruct African philosophies and build upon them. However, using Bodonran as an example again, the view that anything can pass for philosophy will hurt the development of philosophy in Africa. Not everyone is a philosopher. Philosophy requires training. Why must we lament a late start in philosophy? And this gets to the heart of the contention surrounding oral philosophy in Africa and why it is so important for some to broaden conceptions of philosophy. Until recently, philosophy was seen as a preserver of the West and something that separated the higher European intellect and cultivated mind from that of the lesser evolved African. Philosophy began in Greece, and Africans did not possess the mental capacity for logic and reasoning. Coming from an art historical background, these beliefs mirrored conceptions of African capacity to create art. Art was argued to be uniquely European, with its highest epoch for oil painting, which prioritized realism. Africans created curios, fetish objects, and figures. So when the Nigerian painter Aina Onabolu taught himself easel painting, this was seen as a refutation of supposed African inferiority, and as a result, the racist logic underpinning the colonial project. So going back to philosophy, to prove an African capacity to philosophize and record its history disproves the supposed bestial ignorance and amorality of Africans, which justified the civilizing mission and slavery, and continues to influence perceptions of Africans to this day. So while some, such as Bodonran, may argue that Africans should hold themselves to the same standards of philosophy as the West, in which preferably organized systematic reflections defines a philosopher, others, such as Oderuka, claim this perpetuates academic and intellectual imperialism. That Africans should hold themselves to the same standards of philosophy as the West, Oderuka put forth four trends in African philosophy. These were ethno-philosophy, under which philosopher John Mbiti would be considered, professional philosophy, who here is represented by philosopher Pauline Hontonji, nationalist ideological philosophy, which is represented with leaders such as Tanzania and Julius Nyerere, and sage philosophy, which is here represented by the Kenyan woman Paris Nijihi Mufoni, who was included in Oderuka's research on sage philosophy. Oderuka later expanded this to provisional categories of the rationalist school, to which he considered himself and Hontonji to belong, and the historical school, represented here by V.Y. Mudimbe. Obviously, there's immense overlap between these categories. Hontonji is both a professional and rationalist. Oderuka considered Nyerere to be a sage as well as a nationalist ideological philosopher. Nyerere and sage philosophy, which is here represented by the Kenyan woman Paris Nijihi Mufoni, who was included in Oderuka's research on sage philosophy. Oderuka later expanded this to provisional. I'm going to look at four examples of oral philosophy from East Africa. The first is Somali oral poetry, argumentation, and Dakan in the Ogaden region of Ethiopia. I'll also consider Odero Oruka's research into sage philosophy in Kenya. Then I want to look briefly at Siad Muhammad Abdile Hassan in British Somaliland or the Dervish state, as well as Julius Nyerere's poetic Ujamaa in Tanzania. I'm going to look at 4 examples of oral philosophy from East Africa. The first is Somali oral poetry. Ethno-philosophy could also be considered communal philosophy in which cultural and religious practices predominate. The background photo here could be said to represent an example of ethno-philosophy. Here is a shir or assembly. These are meetings in Somali communities in which adult males typically gather under a tree to discuss issues affecting their Kabul or clan. However, increasingly women also take part. These meetings, one could argue, have been sites of philosophic activity, in which wise and respected elders debated interclan feuds and issues within their clans. Poetic verse played an important role in these assemblies, and Somali societies as a whole, and beyond a small class of religious scholars and coastal areas, the Somali were illiterate. Effective orators were expected to have not only knowledge of Somali tradition, history, lineages, and theology, but also poetic prowess in a process which orators of opposing sides use poetic verse, persuasion, and argumentation to reach consensus regarding the action taken by the clan. For Somalis, Saeed S. Samatar says, poetic actions serve a potent task of either violating or enabling the soul of a person or a group. Notable speeches and verses would be memorized and recited for generations. A notable example of such an event is given by Samatar from eastern Ethiopia in 1962, in which at the brink of battle, the eldering shivering beard of the Takato clan used poetic argumentation, weaving together pastoralist tradition, legal precedents, Quranic interpretation, Somali nationalism, and anti-Ethiopian sentiment to push for peace with the Barato clan. And a small snippet is just on the screen. Dakan means ancestral way of life in Somali. Ahmed Ali Ilmi describes the basic tenets of Dakan philosophy as ancestral homeland, family lineage, Somali language, and being Somali as an embodiment, all of which Ilmi posits are upheld by Somali communities throughout the world. Shivering Beard tapped into these dark and philosophic tenets. Using Somali language as a medium, Shivering Beard stressed the righteousness of his Dakota clan and lineage, the shared values of Somali people as Muslims, with interrelated values and shared customary law, and the shared struggle of the larger Ogaden clan in their lands under the oppression of the Ethiopian state. While Dark philosophy, as Ilmi describes it, could come from what Odero Oruka would call the uncritical part of African tradition, which he identifies as a shortcoming of ethnophilosophy, Samatar's account of Shivering Beard perhaps shows that in practice, critical thinkers still hotly debated tradition and custom. However, this too could be argued to have only become about because of regional Somali nationalist trends, perceived Ethiopian imperialism, capitalism, and the increasing sedentarization of the Somali population, which weakened the primacy of the clan. This is exemplified by Shivering Beard as a town-dwelling trader on one side and his oratorial opponent, Shiagab, as a pure pastoralist. Could Shivering Beard have been a sage? Odero Oruka describes a sage as one who is consistently concerned with the fundamental, ethical, and empirical issues and questions relevant to the society and his ability to offer insightful solutions to some of those issues. And differentiating between a sage and a philosopher, he remarks, a sage is wise, he has insight, but he employs this for the ethical betterment of his, her community. A philosopher may be a sage and vice versa, but many philosophers do lack the ethical commitment and inspiration found in the sage. By this metric, Shivering Beard partially fulfills those of the sage in that he put forward a notion of morality and righteousness that would save his immediate community from escalating violence that had already claimed many lives and foster unity in the wider community of Ogaden Somalis in the service of resisting the oppression of the Ethiopian state. However, as for consistent engagement with fundamental ethical and empirical issues in society, there is simply just not enough to verify if Shivering Beard would fit this definition of sage philosophy. Odero Oruka's study into sage philosophy was an interesting breakthrough into possible forms of oral philosophy in the African context and beyond. While yes, to reach beyond the sage's communities, their ideas need to be preserved through writing or audio recordings, his research to many such as Kwasi Wiredu has confirmed among our traditional peoples there are original philosophers from whom we have something to learn. Moving on to a more controversial candidate for sage philosopher is the Somali religious and political leader and poet Saeed Mohammed Abdile Hassan, or as he was known derogatorily by the English, the Mad Mullah. Hassan led a resistance movement against the Ethiopians and Europeans at the turn of the century that was known as the Dervish movement, which, as the name would suggest, had a strong religious component on top of his anti-imperialist aims. Hassan was born in what would become British Somaliland, and from a young age he displayed prodigious eloquence, wit, intelligence, and horsemanship. As previously stated, Oratorial excellence in poetry is revered in Somali society, which Samatar describes was not treasured so much for its artistic value as for the influential, sometimes sinister role it plays in molding people's opinions and attitudes. Like his father and grandfather, Hassan traveled extensively in pursuit of Islamic education, and influenced by African Islamic revival movements at the turn of the century, such as the Mahdi movement in Sudan, Hassan pursued a militant form of neo-Sufi mysticism, which Samar describes as characterized by the strict hierarchy and rigid centralization of a religious order, and in both respects it represented a radical departure from the ephemeral alliances of clan politics. The Sayyid prescribed the tribal identities of his followers in favor of a new identity based on religious ideology. Hassan was able to utilize his poetic prowess, charisma, and religious education to build support for his jihad against the infidel rule in the Somali Peninsula, particularly the Ethiopians and the British. However, the supposed rejection of clannishness, commitment to anti-colonialism, and asceticism was on numerous occasions called into question, as he frequently played on the historical interclan enmity, such as that between the Dawood and the Isak, demonized certain clans, entered into partnership with the Italians, and exercised a monopolistic control on trade. For these reasons, Hassan has been a controversial figure in Somali history. While the English had a harsh view of him, calling him a monomaniac, a libertine, a profligate, and a cutthroat tyrant whose oriental mind saw sensual pleasures as the natural rewards of earthly power, the Italian view was far more sympathetic, with Francesco S. Caroselli describing him as a little African Napoleon, equal to the great Corsican, perhaps only in his hatred for the English. The Dervish movement heavily influenced pan-Somali nationalist movements that developed throughout the Somali Peninsula from the 1930s onwards. The Siad Barre government, in collaboration with the Soviet Union, used Hassan to craft a national cultural heritage that displays the primacy of the clan and pastoralism as well to legitimate claims to the Ogaden region. An example of the effort is the monumental statue erected in Mogadishu in the 1980s, pictured here. The success of Barre's efforts, however, seemed doubtful when the monument was immediately destroyed in the wake of his government's dissolution. Samatar describes a poet's role in Somali society as to record and immortalize in verse the history of his people, and since the poet's talents are employed not only to give expression to a private emotion, but also to address vital community concerns, his verse reflects the feelings, thoughts, and actions of his age. One could argue this considerably overlaps with the role of the sage philosopher. While Hassan was certainly a poet, mullah, and political leader, it could also be argued that Hassan was a sage philosopher who used oral poetry as an accessible and culturally significant medium to reach the masses. Yes, Hassan's worldview was deeply rooted in mysticism and reformist trends in the wider Islamic community, but he also took extreme care in composing his verses, with the aim of exposing the falsehood of his opponents and revealing the truth of his arguments. His argumentation relied not only on his deep belief in mysticism or in-depth theological knowledge from his religious education, but also his pastoralist culture, Dakan, and other anti-colonial movements. Going back to Adero Ruka's definition of sage, Hassan did show consistent engagement with ethical and empirical issues within Dawood and Somali society, mainly relating to his opposition to Qadariya and the Christian imperialist expansion in the Somali Peninsula. However, he also extended his criticism to Somali clan-based politics and social organization. Moving on to another poet and philosopher, Julius Nyerere could also be seen as an example of an oral philosopher. Nyerere was an anti-colonial activist and the first president of Tanganyika, then later Tanzania, who developed the political philosophy of Ujamaa, which is a Swahili word that translates to fraternity or familyhood. Nyerere sought to extend the traditional African family beyond tribal or even national boundaries, envisioning a form of socialism rooted in traditional African communitarian values. For Nyerere, Africans traditionally lived according to the basics of socialism, and the country's development required a uniquely African approach based on equality, self-reliance, discipline, communal living and ownership, and democracy. Pictured on the left is a painting by Tanzanian modernist painter Simon Tira, whose work was inspired by Ujamaa. Nyerere published his developing Ujamaa philosophy in numerous books. However, he also composed poetry borrowing from Swahili poetic tradition in an effort to reach the largely illiterate population and educate them on Ujamaa. For example, Nyerere and Sadan Kandoro exchanged poems in the Kuchibanza style, an argumentative call and response style of poetry after the Arusha Declaration of 1967, in which Nyerere's party, the Tanganyika African National Union, formally established Tanzania's commitment to Ujamaa policies. Historically, Swahili poetry was written and or orally performed on the spot, and had been used as a medium for social, political, and religious discourse. Using an African art form as a tool to spread his African political and social philosophy could be argued to be a form of oral philosophy. In fact, Anne Beard-Stecker argues that poetic exchange in Swahili had a central role in the formulation of basic terms of Ujamaa discourse. However, it also revealed the tensions underlying the Ujamaa philosophy, not only in its increasingly prescriptiveness, but also brings doubts to Nyerere's claim that Africans do not need to be taught socialism. Swahili, already a fairly developed language, with a long written history, was further developed by Nyerere to express the philosophic and technical aspects of Ujamaa and serve as modern Tanzania's lingua franca. Elena Rotova posits that the underdevelopment of modern terminologies in African languages is a stumbling block to the exploration of philosophic ideas in African languages. The aforementioned tensions underlying Ujamaa still remain, and the ideology itself has been criticized for its idealization and essentializing of traditional Africa. Swahili itself is a language that was created through trade with Africa and Asia, enslaved people being a significant component of that trade for centuries, which undermines Nyerere's vision of an equal socialist pre-colonial Africa. However, that Nyerere developed Swahili and used a traditional medium of intellectual discourse to propagate Ujamaa is commendable in that philosophic ideas could be articulated and progress through discussion. Although the poetry was indeed written, it could be seen as complementary to its oral performances, given Swahili poetry's rich oral tradition. Oral philosophy presents interesting conundrums. If it remains in traditional settings such as the Somali shir, it will likely remain esoteric and ephemeral. That said, Sayyid Muhammad Abdillah Hassan's poetic argumentation has survived for generations, and it spread throughout the largely illiterate Somali diaspora due to the importance that Somali pastoralist culture places on the accurate memorization of poetic speech, and as proto-pan-Somali nationalism inspired political movements throughout the Horn of Africa. Samatar posits that increasing literacy and sedentarization of Somalis has weakened poetic memorization, and to once again evoke Bodunren, had not scholars such as Samatar recorded Hassan's words in writing, Hassan's poetry might have eventually been lost to time. However, Sada Mire argues that oral communication and transmission of skills is still the main system of learning. In Somaliland, where many people are still illiterate, technology such as mobile phones and televisions have only widened its scope. Nyerere's use of poetry could then be seen as a middle ground, in which conventional written philosophy and oral philosophy are used in tandem to reach scholars and peasants alike. However, this two-faced criticism, the didactic approach, broke Swahili poetic convention that valued metaphor, proverb, ambiguity, and genuine argumentation. The wide dissemination of poetry to non-Swahili Tanzanians and its didacticism displaced the cultural context of the medium. It is also worth noting the androcentrism of all these cases of oral philosophy, which, though not intrinsic to oral philosophy, of course manifests itself when these are societies where women's speech is restricted and scrutinized. If African philosophy lacks a documented history and debates, then the work of philosophers such as Odera Oruka can take it beyond esoteric culture and anthropological study to formalize philosophic analysis and critique. To make another art historical allusion, African art faces comparable dilemmas. East Africa is commonly believed to be an artistic desert. Some may argue that applying Western concepts such as what art is onto non-Western cultures is inappropriate. While others may say we need to expand our definitions to include body painting, basketry, storytelling, and dance. And the line between craft and art in the African fine art world is extremely blurry and dependent on institutional validation. Alfred Gell put forward the institutional theory of art, in which he states there is no quality in the art object as material vehicle that definitively qualifies it to be or not to be an artwork. Whether it is or not is dependent on whether or not it is taken to be one by an art world, that is, a collectivity interested in making, sharing, and debating critical judgments of this type. I'm inclined to believe that philosophy can be seen in a similar light. I agree with Adora in that the lack of knowledge about someone's philosophy is not proof of its non-existence, but for the academic discipline of philosophy, critique and analysis of African oral philosophy must be mediated through those within the institution, or else it will not be recognized as philosophy proper. Between the esoteric African communities, or the esoteric world of academics, oral philosophy is caught between two worlds, with little overlap, without exceptional charismatic figures such as Hassan and Nyerere to bridge them. Bridging this gap, then, should be a priority for African philosophers if the field is ever to develop and benefit African communities.